The Mistress of Sydenham Plantation, a short story by Sarah O. Jewett. A high wind was blowing from the water into the Beaufort streets, a wind with as much reckless hilarity as March could give to her breezes, but soft and spring-like, almost early summer-like, in its warmth. In the gardens of the old southern houses that stood along the bay, roses and pettisporum trees were blooming, with their delicious fragrance. It was the time of wistarias and wild white lilies, of the last yellow jasmines and the first Cherokee roses. It was the Saturday before Easter Sunday. In the quaint churchyard of Old St. Helena's Church, a little way from the bay, young figures were busy among the graves with industrious gardening. At first sight, one might have thought that this pretty service was rendered only from loving sentiments of loyalty to one's ancestors. For under the great live oaks, the sturdy brick walls about the family burying places and the gravestones themselves were moss-grown and ancient-looking. Yet here and there the wounded look of the earth appealed to the eye and betrayed a new-made grave. The old sarcophagi and heavy tablets of the historic Beaufort families stood side by side with plain wooden crosses. The armorial bearings and long epitaphs of the one and the brief lettering of the other suggested the changes that had come with the war to these families, yet somehow the wooden cross touched one's heart with closer sympathy. The padlocked gates to the small enclosures stood open, while gentle girls passed in and out with their Easter flowers of remembrance. On the high churchyard wall and great gate-posts perched many a mockingbird, and the golden light changed the twilight under the live oaks to a misty warmth of colour. The birds began to sing louder. The grey moss that hung from the heavy boughs swayed less and less, and gave the place a look of pensive silence. In the church itself, most of the palms and rose branches were already in place for the next day's feast, and the old organ followed a fresh young voice that was being trained for the Easter anthem. The 5 doors of the church were standing open. On the steps of that eastern door which opened midway up the side aisle, where the morning sun had shone in upon the white faces of a hospital in wartime, in this eastern doorway sat 2 young women. "I was just thinking," one was saying to the other, "that for the first time Mistress Sydenham has forgotten to keep this day. You know that when she has forgotten everything and everybody else, she has known when Easter came, and has brought flowers to her graves." "Has she been more feeble lately, do you think?" asked the younger of the 2. "Mamma saw her the other day, and thought that she seemed more like herself, but she looked very old too. She told Mamma to bring her dolls, and she would give her some bits of silk to make them gowns. Poor Mamma! And she had just been wondering how she could manage to get us ready for summer this year. Celestine and me." And the speaker smiled wistfully. "It is a mercy that the dear old lady did forget all that happened." And the friends brushed some last bits of leaves from their skirts and rose and walked away together through the churchyard. The ancient church waited through another Easter even, with its flowers and long memory of prayer and praise. The great earthquake had touched it lightly, time had coloured it softly, and the earthly bodies of its children were gathered near its walls in peaceful sleep. From one of the high houses which stood fronting the sea with their airy balconies and colonnades had come a small, slender figure, like some shy, dark thing of twilight out into the bright sunshine. The street was empty for the most part. Before 1 or 2 of the cheap German shops, a group of men watched the little old lady step proudly by. She was a very stately gentlewoman for one so small and thin. She was feeble too, and bending somewhat with the weight of years, but there was true elegance and dignity in the way she moved, and those who saw her, persons who shuffled when they walked and boasted loudly of the fallen pride of the South, were struck with sudden deference and admiration. Behind the lady walked a grey-headed Negro, a man who was troubled in spirit, who sometimes gained a step or 2, and offered an anxious but quite unheeded remonstrance. He was a poor, tottering old fellow. He wore a threadbare evening coat that might have belonged to his late master 30 years before. The pair went slowly along the Bay Street to the end of a row of new shops, and the lady turned decidedly toward the water and approached the ferry steps. Her servitor groaned aloud, but waited in respectful helplessness. There was a group of Negro children on the steps, employed in the dangerous business of crab fishing. At the foot, in his flat-bottomed boat, sat a wondering Negro lad, who looked up in apprehension at his passengers. The lady seemed like a ghost. Old Peter, with whose scorn of modern beings and their ways he was partially familiar, old Peter was making frantic signs to him to put out from shore. But the lady's calm desire for obedience prevailed, and presently, out of the knot of idlers that gathered quickly, one, more chivalrous than the rest, helped the strange adventurers down into the boat. It was the fashion to laugh and joke in Beaufort when anything unusual was happening before the eyes of the younger part of the coloured population, but as the ferryman pushed off from shore, even the crabfishers kept awe-struck silence, and there were speechless open mouths and much questioning of eyes that showed their whites in vain. Somehow or other, before the boat was out of hail, long before it had passed the first bank of raccoon oysters, the tide being at the ebb, it was known by 50 people that for the first time in more than 20 years, the mistress of the old Sydenham Plantation on St. Helena's Island had taken it into her poor daft head to go to look after her estates, her crops, and her people. Everybody knew that her estates had been confiscated during the war, that her people owned it themselves now, in 3 and 5 and even 20-acre lots, that her crops of rice and Sea Island cotton were theirs, planted and hoed and harvested on their own account. All these years she had forgotten Sydenham and the live oak avenue and the outlook across the water to the hunting islands, where the deer ran wild. She had forgotten the war. She had forgotten her children and her husband, except that they had gone away. The graves to which she carried Easter flowers were her mother's and her father's graves, and her life was spent in a strange dream. Old Peter sat facing her in the boat. The ferryman pulled lustily at his oars, and they moved quickly along in the ebbing tide. The ferryman longed to get his freight safely across. He was in a fret of discomfort whenever he looked at the clear-cut, eager face before him in the stern. How still and straight the old mistress sat. Where was she going? He was awed by her presence and took refuge as he rowed in needless talk about the coming of the sandflies and the great drumfish to Beaufort waters. But Peter had clasped his hands together and bowed his old back as if he did not dare to look anywhere but at the bottom of the boat. Peter was still groaning softly. The old lady was looking back over the water to the row of fine houses, the once luxurious summer homes of Retts and Barnwells, of many a famous household now scattered and impoverished. The ferryman had heard of more one than bereft lady or gentleman who lived in seclusion in the old houses. He knew that Peter still served a mysterious mistress with exact devotion, while most of the elderly coloured men and women who had formed the retinues of the old families were following their own affairs, far and wide. "Oh, Lord, oh, miss, what can I go to do?" mumbled Peter, with his head in his hands. "That'll be nothing to see. Po old miss, I do know what you say. Trouble, trouble." But the mistress of Sydenham Plantation had a way of speaking but seldom, and of rarely listening to what anyone was pleased to say in return. Out of the mistiness of her clouded brain, a thought had come with unwonted clearness. She must go to the island. Her husband and sons were detained at a distance. It was the time of year to look after corn and cotton. She must attend to her house and her slaves. The remembrance of that news of battle and of the 3 deaths that had left her widowed and childless had faded away in the illness it had brought. She never comprehended her loss. She was like one bewitched into indifference. She remembered something of her youth and kept a simple routine of daily life, and that was all. "I thought she done forget everything," groaned Peter again. "Oh, Lord, have mercy on all amiss." The landing place on Lady's Island was steep and sandy, and the oarsman watched Peter help the strange passenger up the ascent with a sense of blessed relief. He pushed off a little way into the stream for better self-defence. At the top of the bluff was a rough shed, built for shelter, and Peter looked about him eagerly, while his mistress stood, expectant and imperious, in the shade of a pride of India tree that grew among the live oaks and pines of a wild thicket. He was wretched with a sense of her discomfort, though she gave no sign of it. He had learned to know by instinct all that was unspoken. In the old times, she would have found 4 oarsmen waiting with a cushioned boat at the ferry. She would have found a saddle horse or a carriage ready for her on Lady's Island for the 5 miles' journey, but the carriage had not come. The poor grey-headed old man recognised her displeasure. He was her only slave left if she did but know it. For Gord's sake, get me some kin of a cart. Ola, miss, she done wake up and mean to go out to Sydenham this day, urged Peter. Who dis hoss and kiart in de shed? Who make these a track with huffs just now like they done ride by? You go get somebody for me or she be right mad sure. The elderly guardian of the shed, who was also of the old regime, hobbled away quickly and backed out a steer that was broken to harness and a rickety two-wheeled cart. Their owner had left them there for some hours and had crossed the ferry to Beaufort. Old Mistress must be obeyed, and they looked toward her beseechingly where she was waiting, deprecating her disapproval of this poor apology for a conveyance. The lady long since had ceased to concern herself with the outward shapes of things. She accepted this possibility of carrying out her plans, and they lifted her light figure to the chair in the cart's end while Peter mounted before her with all a coachman's dignity. He once had his ambitions of being her coachman, and they moved slowly away through the deep sand. "My God Almighty, look out for us now," said Peter over and over. "Ola miss, she done forget, good Lord. She done forget how de good marser up there done took from her everything. She spect now she find Sydenham all the same likes it was foe de war. She ain't know about what's been since day of de gun shoot on Port Royal and Daraway. Oh, Lord Almighty, you know how you stove her po head with dem gun shoot. Be easy to all, miss." But as Peter pleaded in the love and sorrow of his heart, the lady who sat behind him was unconscious of any cause for grief. Some sweet vagaries in her own mind were matched to the loveliness of the day. All her childhood, spent among the rustic scenes of these fertile sea islands, was yielding for her now an undefined pleasantness of association. The straight-stemmed palmettos stood out with picturesque clearness against the great level fields, with their straight furrows running out of sight. Figures of men and women followed the furrow paths slowly. Here were men and horses bending to the ploughshare, and there women and children sowed with steady hand the rich seed of their crops. There were touches of colour in the head kerchiefs. There were sounds of songs as the people worked, not gay songs of the evening, but some repeated line of a hymn to steady the patient feet and make the work go faster. The unconscious music of the blacks, who sing as the beetle drones or the cricket chirps slowly under the dry grass. It had a look of permanence, this cotton planting. It was a thing to paint, to relate itself to the permanence of art, an everlasting duty of mankind. Terrible if a thing of force and compulsion and for another's gain, but the birthright of the children of Adam, and not unrewarded nor unnatural when one drew by it one's own life from the earth. Peter glanced through the hedgerows furtively, this way and that. What would his mistress say to the cabins that were scattered all about the fields now, and that were no longer put together in the long lines of the quarters? He looked down a deserted lane where he well remembered 50 cabins on each side of the way. It was gay there of a summer evening. The old times had not been without their pleasures, and the poor old man's heart leaped with the vague delight of his memories. He had never been on the block. He was born and bred at old Sydenham. He had been trusted in house and field. "I done like dem old times de best," ventures Peter presently to his unresponding companion. "Dere was good 'bout dem times. I say I like de old times good as any. Young folks may be a change for me." He was growing grey in the face with apprehension. He did not dare to disobey. The slow-footed beast of burden was carrying them towards Sydenham step by step, and he dreaded the moment of arrival. He was like a mesmerised creature who can only obey the force of a directing will. But under pretence of handling the steer's harness, he got stiffly to the ground to look at his mistress. He could not turn to face her as he sat in the cart. He could not drive any longer and feel her there behind him. The silence was too great. It was a relief to see her placid face and to see even a more youthful look in its worn lines. She had been a very beautiful woman in her young days, and a solemn awe fell upon Peter's tender heart, lest the veil might be lifting from her hidden past, and there, alone with him on the old plantation, she would die of grief and pain. God only knew what might happen. The old man mounted to his seat, and again they plodded on. "Peter," said the mistress. He was always frightened when she spoke. "Peter, we must hurry. I was late in starting. I have a great deal to do. Urge the horses." "Yes, miss. Yes, miss." And Peter Peter laughed aloud nervously and brandished his sassafras switch while the steer hastened a little. They had come almost to the gates. "Who are these?" the stately wayfarer asked once, as they met some persons who gazed at them in astonishment. "I 'spect dem de good ladies from de north, what come down to show de coloured folks how to do reading," answered Peter bravely. "It do look kind of comfortable over here," he added wistfully, half to himself. He could not understand even now how oblivious she was of the great changes on St. Helena's. There were curious eyes watching from the fields, and here by the roadside an aged black woman came to her cabin door. "Lord!" exclaimed Peter, "what kin I do now? And old Sybil, she's done crazy too, and dey'll be mischievous together." The steer could not be hurried past, and Sybil came and leaned against the wheel. "Mornin', mistis," said Sybil, "and yo too, Peter. How's all? Day ob judgment's comin' in mornin'. Some nice buttermilk. I done get rich. Tat's my cow." And she pointed to the field and chuckled. Peter felt as if his brain were turning. "Bless the Lord, I no more slave," said old Sybil, looking up with impudent scrutiny at her old mistress's impassive face. "You know Mars Middleton, what you buy me from? He my foster brother. We push away from same breast. He got trouble, po gentleman. He sorry to sell Sybil. He give me $silver dat day and feel bad. Neighbour Min, I say, I get good young mistis at Sydenham. I like her well, I did so. I pick my £200 all days and I ain't whipped. Too bad sold me po Mars Middleton, but he in trouble. He done come see me last planting," Sybil went on proudly. "Oh God, he grown old and poor looking. He come in just in dat do, and he say, 'Sybil, I long and long to see you, and now I see you.' And he kiss and kiss me. And dere's one wide river of Jordan, and we'll soon be dere black and white. I was right glad I see old Mars Middleton 'fore I die." The old creature poured forth the one story of her great joy and pride. She had told it 1,000 times. It had happened, not the last planting, but many plantings ago. It remained clear when everything else was confused. There was no knowing what she might say next. She began to take the strange steps of a slow dance, and Peter urged his steer forward, while his mistress said suddenly, "Goodbye, Sybil. I am glad you are doing so well," with a strange irrelevancy of graciousness. It was in the old days before the war that Sybil had fallen insensible one day in the cotton field. Did her mistress think that it was still that year? And Peter's mind could not puzzle out this awful day of anxiety. They turned at last into the live oak avenue. They had only another half-mile to go. And here, in the place where the lady had closest association, her memory was suddenly revived almost to clearness. She began to hurry Peter impatiently. It was a mischance that she had not been met at the ferry. She was going to see to putting the house in order, and the women were all waiting. It was autumn, and they were going to move over from Beaufort. It was spring next moment, and she had to talk with her overseers. The old imperiousness flashed out. Did not Peter know that his master was kept at the front, and the young gentlemen were with him, and their regiment was going into action? It was a blessing to come over and forget it all, but Peter must drive. They had taken no care of the avenue, how the trees were broken in the storm. The house needed. They were going to move the next day, but one and nothing was ready. A party of gentlemen were coming from Charleston in the morning. They passed the turn of the avenue. They came out to the open lawn, and the steer stopped and began to browse. Peter shook from head to foot. He climbed down by the wheel and turned his face slowly. "All amiss," he said feebly. "All amiss." She was looking off into space. The cart jerked as it moved after the feeding steer. The mistress of Sydenham Plantation had sought her home in vain. The crumbled, fallen chimneys of the house were there among the weeds, and that was all. On Christmas Day and Easter Day, many an old man and woman come into St. Helena's Church who are not seen there the rest of the year. There are not a few recluses in the parish who come to listen to their teacher and to the familiar prayers, read with touching earnestness and simplicity, as one seldom hears the prayers read anywhere. This Easter morning dawned clear and bright, as Easter morning should. The fresh-bloomed roses and lilies were put in their places. There was no touch of paid hands anywhere, and the fragrance blew softly about the church. As you sat in your pew, you could look out through the wide-open doors and see the drooping branches and the birds as they sat singing on the gravestones. The sad faces of the old people, the cheerful faces of the young, passed by up the aisle. One figure came to sit alone in one of the pews, to bend its head in prayer after the ancient habit. Peter led her as usual to the broad aisle doorway and helped her, stumbling himself up the steps, and many eyes filled with tears as his mistress went to her place. Even the tragic moment of yesterday was lost already in the acquiescence of her mind, as the calm sea shines back to the morning sun when another wreck has gone down.